Welcome to Bold Solutions, Better Planet. This evening's discussion is in honor of Earth Day 2023 and is co-hosted by the OSU Alumni Association and the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, CEOS for short. I'm Des Anderson, Director of Alumni Relations for CEOS. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinafu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed from reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Indigenous people are valued contributing members of the Oregon State community and represent multiple sovereign tribes among students, faculty, staff, and alumni. OSU accepts its responsibility for understanding the continuing impact of that history on these communities and is committed in the spirit of self-reflection, learning, reconciliation, and partnership to ensure that this institution of higher learning will be of enduring benefit not only to the state of Oregon, but also to the people on whose ancestral lands it is now located. The CEOS Earth Day lecture was launched in 2022, and we're excited to be here for our second year, hearing from some of OSU's most distinguished alumni on the front lines of creating climate solutions, imagining hope, and strengthening our resiliency in the face of enormous planetary and societal change. Thank you, audience, for joining us for what's sure to be a thoughtful and inspiring conversation. You're invited to share your questions at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will answer as many as time allows. We're very pleased to have as our moderator this evening, Tuba Oskin-Haller, Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Welcome, Tuba.
Thank you, Des. Thank you, everybody, for being with us this evening. Thank you, Des, for that really thoughtful opening, and also more broadly for working on the organization of this event. As Des mentioned, I'm Tuba, and I have the privilege and pleasure to be the Dean of Oregon State University's wonderful College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Most of you know this, but I'll just state it again. Our college is at the forefront of furthering our understanding of how the Earth works. We're nestled within this land-grant university, Oregon State University, with its research, education, and engagement missions. And our college is a premier research and educational institution in Earth and Ocean sciences. In fact, our college is ranked number 3 in the world in oceanography. So it should come as no surprise then that we have some very preeminent alumni who are working at the forefront of Earth and Ocean sciences, in particular when it comes to thinking about how science can enable solutions to problems society is facing today. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome 3 of them tonight to our college's 2023 Earth Day event. With us today are Julie Pullen, who is a partner and chief scientist at the venture capital firm Propeller, Margaret Leinen, who is the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the dean of the School of Marine Sciences at the University of California, San Diego, and Rick Spinrad, who is the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I've introduced them to you here in alphabetical order by first name, which is how they were also lined up in our webpage. And this is really partially because we're an informal bunch. We've known each other for a really long time. And OSU folks and alumni, we tend to be the kind of people who roll up our sleeves and work elbow to elbow together in order to further the work that we've set out to do. Now, these 3, all of them alumni from OSU, bring really interesting backgrounds, and I could deliver a lengthy introduction to you all about them, but I thought it would be more informative and more fun to have them give us a little bit more information about their background and their work, and and how they see themselves relate to our theme of Bold Solutions, Better Planet. So with that, I'll hand it over to Julie. Julie, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how your work relates to our ideas.
Thanks so much for that, and really happy to be here with you all. So I feel like my career has been about finding my way to climate solutions. As you mentioned, I did my PhD at Oregon State in physical oceanography and really moved into the area of the interface with the atmosphere, so the ocean atmosphere communications. And I was an oceanographer with the Navy before I became an ocean engineering professor, leading field campaigns to really look at the processes that influence how the ocean and atmosphere respond to each other, and crucially, how to improve the representation of those processes in our system models. So I've been at the forefront of field campaigns in both the ocean and atmosphere, challenging the Earth system models to do a better job at improving them. I think careers are often defined by transformative moments that create turning points for us, where we can really orient into some of the activities and people and places that may be calling to us. And my transformative moment was when I was on a Fulbright as a visiting professor in the Philippines. And this was in 2018. I was teaching tropical meteorology and tending a field site in the north of Luzon, which kept on getting washed away by typhoons. And I also saw how the people that I had come to love in the Philippines were being impacted so much by climate change. The Philippines is ranked at the top, or the most impacted country in the world for climate risk and impacts. And that really touched me deeply. And I came back committed to doing more in relation to climate. I left academia. I worked on developing the early products for a climate risk analytics startup, Jupiter Intelligence. And really, I did that because I was keen to see how we could start motivating this flywheel of action, where if you can quantify your exposure to climate risk across different perils, from flooding, heat wave, drought, and get the attention of businesses on their particular vulnerabilities, that could be a flywheel of action that would drive more attention on what was needed in order to really step up on the climate mitigation front. And that has happened. And yet it's not enough. I mean, we are on the threshold of reaching a 1.5 degree globally average temperature world, which means a number of near-term tipping points, all localized in the oceans, are really in front of us. These are the loss of the coral reefs, the loss of polar ice, and major changes in ocean circulation. And so I actually left my work at the climate risk startup last year in order to more solidly orient into climate solutions and to invest in catalyzing the solutions to really come to market quickly as using the lever of venture capital. So that's where I am now. I'm happy to tell you more about what I do in that regard, but really want to give a chance to hear from Margaret and Rick, who I've had the great honor to work with in different capacities across my time in the ocean atmosphere space.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much for that story arc, sort of leading us through how you advanced through your career. And Margaret, you too have had experience in industry and academia in various different forms, sort of weaved your way back and forth. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Hi, everybody. And it was great to hear Julie. I hadn't heard that story about you in the Philippines. I started college as a geology major, and it seemed to me that, and I was interested in sedimentary rocks, and it seemed that as long as people were talking about rocks that formed in beaches, in rivers, close to shore, that they could really articulate what the environment was and interpret them. But this was quite a while ago now, and it seemed as though whenever I asked about the ocean or rocks that came from the ocean, things got kind of vague. So I thought, I'll go to oceanography, I'll really learn about what's happening there, and then I'll go back to geology. And I just never made it back. So my area, I went to Oregon State when I wanted to do that. And I worked in what's called paleoceanography. So understanding the oceans and the atmosphere and how they influence sediments so that we can use sediments to interpret the past. So that was my direction. And I did that for a long time. And my moment was in the mid 80s when climatologists and climate scientists began talking about how much CO2 we put in the atmosphere. And I began to understand that the difference between CO2 in the atmosphere in glacial times and interglacial times was almost exactly the amount of CO2 that we had put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So that was a long time ago. We put a lot more in, but I said, okay, if that's how much we put in, maybe glacials and interglacials are a model for what's going to happen. And what happens with CO2 there will be a model for us. And so that started me on my path to really looking at climate and how the ocean interacts with the atmosphere and with all the CO2 to look at climate. Along the way, I've had the opportunity to do several other things. I was at National Science Foundation for a while. And then I went to a small startup company that was trying to get money to do research on one of the techniques for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And earlier this afternoon, I told the rest of the group that it was too early, and there was no propeller fund at that time, and and venture capital was not pouring money into looking at solutions. So it was a heavy lift. I eventually went to a nonprofit to try to talk about how to do that responsibly, and spent some time in both nonprofit and private sector. Went back to oceanography from there, and have been very interested in watching the developments. As Julie said, the focus on not letting warming go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius has also resulted in a special report that said that there is no way for us to now hold warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade without actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's become that the need for those bold solutions has become ever more critical. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. It's great to hear it from you. It's sort of how you navigated all of that over the last 20 years. And then our third speaker tonight is Rick Spinrad. Rick, how about you to tell us a little bit about your journey?
Thanks. Well, let me start too by thanking you and CEOs and all the folks who've joined tonight for inviting me to participate. And it's a real treat to join my good friends and longtime colleagues, Julie and Margaret, whom I've had the pleasure of working with for a long time. Let's just put it that way. And it's a real treat to join you virtually here. I'm actually coming to all of you tonight from Barbados, here at the invitation of the Prime Minister, a remarkable woman named Mia Mottley. Some of you may be aware of what she's been working on. And I'm going to use that as sort of an anchor on my introductory comments. I'll come back to that. So let me roll the tape back a little bit if I can and talk about my start at OSU. I came to OSU specifically because I was interested in the work that Ron Zanneveld was doing in underwater optics. And it was really interesting back then in the 70s. Optics arguably is physics. So I was told you'll be a master's candidate in physical oceanography. Well, I wasn't doing geophysical fluid dynamics. I was doing radiative transfer, and mostly on suspensions of clays and mud. So I finished my master's, and the physical oceanographer said, wait a minute, you're not a real physical oceanographer. You're more like a marine geologist. And so I ended up getting my PhD in marine geology. And the point was, it started me down a path. It was a turning point for me in understanding what true transdisciplinary research is. Something that I would argue back 40 years ago was not necessarily openly or embraced, if you will, in the community. We were traditionalists, biological, physical, chemical, geological oceanographers. So I went down that path. I finished up and had this deep and abiding respect for understanding how physics, chemistry, biology, geology interacted, and had the opportunity to go work for the Navy at the Office of Naval Research to run its underwater optics program, and saw even more the applied value of that transdisciplinary approach. At the time, it was in the middle of the Cold War, and the Navy was looking for any solutions it could find. So could you combine small-scale turbulence with optics, with primary understanding of primary productivity, get a sense of how to make the oceans more transparent, if you will. I did that for a number of years, and then had the opportunity. I was invited by Admiral Jim Watkins to join him in this newly formed consortium for oceanographic research and education. And for me, that was an eye-opening experience, because I'd really not understood how politics worked. And that was a lobby, if you will, for the oceanographic community. And we influenced a lot of policy decisions. We were instrumental, working with people like Margaret and others in developing the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, arguably something that many of the folks in the audience were participants in for many years. And then I got pulled into NOAA to run the National Ocean Service and then NOAA Research, which was sort of a natural extension of the work I'd done with Navy. Long story short, I retired from NOAA and then was called back to have this opportunity. And quite honestly, when I looked at what was going on in the world, when I looked at the extraordinary challenges of climate change, the issues that Julie and Margaret both alluded to in terms of the path that we are on right now, I thought, if I can bring some of that transdisciplinary perspective and understanding of applications of fundamental research to solve problems like we did in the Navy to a higher level as NOAA administrator, I'd be happy to do that. And I also felt like I knew Washington well enough that I could jump into the job and start on day one. So eagerly embraced that. And in the last 2 years, since I've been on the job as NOAA administrator, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of thinking about how oceans are critical to climate solutions, and how these ocean issues have to start playing in the broader agenda, which brings me full circle, because Prime Minister Motley has been one of the most vocal and one of the most convincing world leaders on the need for solutions. She has strong feelings about loss and damage, and especially for some of what we now call the large ocean developing states. We used to call them the small island developing states. And generally a respect for how science can contribute to more effective policymaking. So it's been a long, interesting trajectory, and I would say a lot of it started with that transdisciplinary approach that I was able to get at what was the School of Oceanography back then.
That's great. Thank you for that perspective, Rick. I really appreciate that. All three of you really talked about the importance of bringing multiple disciplines to bear on these problems, on these questions. And that certainly is something that resonates with me, given that my own personal work has sort of been at that interface of engineering and science. But I'll just share with everybody that one of the reasons why we chose this theme of bold solutions and better planet is the clear and urgent need for us as a society to address the very issues that we are facing today that are related to our planet, right? And you've heard about some of them here: natural disasters, be it earthquakes or wildfires or floods, climate change, be it global warming, sea level rise, CO2, ocean acidification. I think it's really clear, though, that we need to do this in a way that is economically sustainable, right? Because otherwise it's not going to get done, while also following the sort of moral imperative that I think all of us are now feeling in our gut to do this in a way that addresses longstanding inequities. and some of you spoke about that already. I feel like we're here at OSU, feel this in our gut, and we're a land grant institution, and we really transdisciplinary with low boundaries to interaction, so we could really be part of the solution. And I know you three have thought about these tensions quite a bit too. And yet we also feel a lot of hope. And I think you all in the audience, as you listen to our panelists, I think you will start to understand why. Our panelists really span experiences across all different sectors, right? For-profit, nonprofit, academic, industry, government. So maybe I want to start out with that. I want to start the conversation with just a couple of questions that I will ask our panel members. We already have a few questions from the audience in the Q&A. Please don't hold back. Go ahead and put your questions in as they pop up. And then we will transition to reading some of those questions to our panelists. But let's talk a little bit more about the role of all of these different ways of engaging, venture capitalists, responsible climate engineering, new blue economy, nonprofits. We certainly have folks in our audience here who I think hail from all of those different kinds of places. So in what ways can folks get engaged through all of these different, vantage points in order to help with this transdisciplinary work of getting at solutions? Any thoughts about that?
So I think one of the more gratifying aspects of this moment that we find ourselves in is just the sheer talent that is orienting into this space, and the groups that are springing up to help people find their place and connect with their capacity to contribute. I think of entities like Climate Draft, which was set up by several different venture capital funds in the climate tech space to really help the talent who's wanting to work in startups, but maybe have tech expertise, but not climate expertise, really get grounded in how they can make a difference. And really, I think for me, that's been one of the most exciting aspects of this is, encouraging people to see themselves as part of the solution and solvers, and the broader and more diverse the background, the better for what we can accomplish together in collaboration. I think that's the point that I want to leave.
That's a great thought, Julie. Really, all of us can bring our talents to bear on this.
I'd like to double down on what Julie just said. I think all too often we stay within our comfort zone with the groups that we want to talk with and engage with. When I came to NOAA, I asked the staff, give me your lists of the seemingly disparate groups with whom we have not engaged. And my thesis was that there is not a sector or a group for whom our work on climate products and services did not have some impact. And it's been remarkable. We've worked with groups like the American Medical Association, the National Association of Realtors, faith-based communities. And with an audience like this, it's easy for people, I think, to understand where those connections can be made. But it's also incumbent on all of us in the research community to make those, to reach out to those sectors. And so my recommendation would be to ask people, think about a group that you've not necessarily engaged with before, and how can you get to them? And all too often what I've found in these meetings is they start with people saying, well, we don't really know why you want to talk with us. And a half an hour into it, they're saying, we've got a committee that's going to meet on this. Can you come talk with them? Can you get us some information on, climate projections, that kind of thing. So there's, I would argue, no community that does not have a connection of some sort to the research activities we're involved with.
Thank you for that. Oh, Margaret, you're muted.
I saw. I would agree with that. And also for those that aren't involved with the research community, community action is incredibly important. We're not going to find one of these through our research, find one technique or one solution that's going to be a silver bullet. And you know, way back in the 90s, Bill McKibben said, we're not looking for a silver bullet. It's going to be silver buckshot. And there's going to be a lot that's necessary. And all of us have an opportunity to foster that through our own communities. And I think that while we'll definitely need some big solutions, all of the small solutions make it possible to not demand so much of the bigger ones. So, you know, in emphasizing that whatever a community does helps the problem, help solve the problem is important for all of us.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Margaret. And last year's panel spoke about this too, about how important local action really was and how folks can get engaged at the local level through a variety of organizations, not just community, but also, Rick, what you were saying about faith-based communities or realtors, or I think there's a lot of room there.
Tuba, can I just, because as Margaret was talking, I realized examples are very helpful in this, and I want to follow up on the faith-based community, because I suspect some on the audience might be thinking, I don't know where that connection is. And I'll give you a very specific example. We met with a number of faith-based community representatives in the Southwest, in Southern Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico. And it turns out that they were very eager to find out how they could use their houses of worship as cooling centers. But their problem was they needed some planning, even 3 or 4 days lead time. You can see where I'm going, to make a decision about whether to use that synagogue or that church or that mosque as a cooling center. And so it was a very pragmatic solution to say, we can give you a 3 or 4 day heat event forecast that will allow you to prepare to get flyers out in the community and to use your house of worship when it's not being used for worship as a cooling center. Very simple solution, but had we not gotten the groups together to talk about that, they didn't know that was possible. We didn't know there was a need there.
Yeah, that is a really good example, and I really appreciate that. Sometimes specifics are really helpful to get people to think more about, you know, what is it that I can do? And we certainly would love for the audience today to walk away with some ideas as to how they can contribute. Some questions are starting to come in from the audience. And because, Margaret, you also mentioned the fact that, you know, chances are there isn't going to be one silver bullet. In fact, if we were to do that, if we were to sort of glom onto one solution, chances are that solution would come with so many environmental impacts, you know, that would put us exactly where we are today again, right? In fact, the idea is that we should bring many different solutions to bear that in combination will ensure that we don't have unintended consequences going forward into the future, right? And I know that all of you have been engaging with very many different kinds of solutions, be it at the local level, like the example Rick gave, but Margaret, you talked about carbon CO2 capture. Certainly, some of the questions that are coming from the audience are talking about things like renewable energy, hydrogen economy, carbon capture. What about restoring and preserving mangroves? Like, are there nature-based issues or solutions that we can be thinking about? Can you all speak a little bit about some of the potential solutions that you've been engaged in, that you've been thinking about funding, enabling, providing data to move forward? What all is going on out there?
So there's been some really helpful work on the emissions mitigation side of things and the role that the oceans play in this. And this is Rick's area, so I'm gonna let him handle the new blue economy and the, you know, really the role that the transformation in some of these industries can play, particularly around maritime transportation and emissions reduction. I think there's an incredibly powerful lever there that isn't often appreciated by people who don't work directly in and around the oceans. Some of the investing that we are doing at Propeller in the ocean climate solutions space is in what we call ocean carbon, which is the combination of blue carbon and carbon dioxide removal. Blue carbon being those projects that you mentioned, like mangrove protection or restoration, seagrasses, which on their own have the opportunity and benefit and potential to sequester CO2 and is a part of the solution. The open ocean type, more technologically inflected solutions, Margaret has worked on across her career. And I'm continuously amazed by new types and categories of solutions that are coming forward as we look to the oceans as an opportunity to really give us breathing space as we make the shift from these tipping points toward turning points that put us on a better planetary trajectory.
That's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts from Rick or Margaret?
What I would add is that with all of these things, even with things like mangroves, we desperately need more research investment. So recently, for example, some of the work on mangroves showed that over the area of even an acre of mangroves, that there can be more than an order of magnitude difference in carbon sequestration. And we don't know exactly why that is. We have ideas, but if we're going to count on these tools for solutions, we need to understand them better. And I think that one of the most disappointing things to me has been the lack of investment in research over the last 15 to 20 years. And I think that's changing now. And it's really important because what we want is a portfolio of solutions that optimize the efficiency of carbon sequestration or carbon removal, the cost, and the most to minimize the environmental impacts. And in order to form that portfolio and optimize that, we have to know all of those things about all of the techniques. So research de-risks the risk associated with these solutions. And as we do more, we can start to put them in categories of low risk versus high risk, and low efficiency or efficacy versus higher efficacy. And that's really an absolutely critical thing for us to be doing now.
Yeah. Portfolio of solutions. I really love that. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I was going to add, we've got a communications challenge here too. And I think the examples Julie and Margaret brought up with respect to mangrove restoration, coastal restoration, I would add restorative or regenerative aquaculture in there as well. But here's a couple of interesting factoids that suggest the message is not getting out. So the first is that last year, our nation passed the largest climate bill ever passed in our history. That was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and there was $360 billion for climate, is the way it was characterized. When you look at that carefully, easily about 85% of that is for mitigation. That is to say, decarbonization, renewable energy development, and the remainder is going towards adaptation and resilience. And so part of this problem is getting people to understand that there's things that we need to do on an adaptation side immediately. The other part of this is that we know our beneficiaries of some of those resources. And so we started the process of putting out solicitations for good ideas to do many of the things that Julie and Margaret were talking about. The proposal pressure is coming in 10 to 1. And that tells you something about the level of capacity and capability out there for doing these kinds of things. We just don't have the resources. I agree completely with Margaret, but I also think we have if you will, a little bit of a communications challenge to make sure people understand what this is. And last thing I'd bring up, and this is the real question, is what risk are we willing to tolerate? Have we passed a threshold in terms of our risk tolerance for doing some of these things that in some cases are aggressive climate intervention?
Yeah. Rick, you bring up communication, and there is a question from the audience that touches on that. So can you address the barrier presented by misinformation in blocking progress towards solutions, and how can we overcome that barrier? Are there folks who just cannot be reached?
Well, I have a very parochial perspective on that, and that is within the federal government, there is no established authoritative source for climate products and services. There is for weather, if you want to go get weather data. There is for navigational charts. Both of those happen to be NOAA, but you could go into the health arena and say the same thing, that there is established authoritative source for information. That's part of the answer to the communication side. Where do you go to get credible, usable, reliable information? And I'm not saying the federal government is the only place, but within the federal government, there is no established source. So many of us are trying to work on that. Jane Lubchenco, of course, is here in DC working that problem through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But I think that's part of what we need. There is some charlatanism out there. I know it's shocking for people to hear that, but there is some.
Yeah, that's really good to hear that you all are working on that already. And I think that you're right, that would help a lot. I want to pivot to something Margaret said earlier about the portfolio of solutions and what it really means to develop a solution. What is a solution? I think there's a recognition now that a solution is only a solution if it's actually implementable, if a community or a country is willing to engage with that solution, and if the environmental impacts that result from that solution aren't actually worse than what it's trying to solve, right? You know, one of the members of the audience asks a question about carbon dioxide removal and whether or not it takes more carbon to remove a certain kind of carbon dioxide, and how that really is a circular argument and not really helpful. And so you talked a little bit about this. So what does it really mean to develop a solution? Certainly we need to take the human dimension into account. Is this implementable? Is this economically viable? Is this sustainable? Have you all engaged more with that question of, or are we at the stage now where we should just explore everything and then later on winnow with perhaps those questions about whether or not it's implementable? Or is that something we take into account from the get-go?
I think that sort of the pieces that we've talked about that are really decreasing emissions, taking care of enhancing renewables and so forth, are the things that we absolutely have to do, and they help us. I think the question about solutions in terms of removing carbon is more difficult, and it is one. In order to make a difference, it's going to take a lot of resources, and so we have to be applying those resources to things that have the best chance of removing a lot of carbon and that have the cheapest cost and the least environmental impact. And we can't know that now, and that's why looking at all of these things and understanding the results of research are important. It's also going to take a systems analysis as well, because as you do something, new technology and new ideas start happening. And for example, when you look at solar, so if you said even 20 years ago, oh, we're going to deploy solar at a huge scale, We didn't have the costs of solar down. We didn't have the technologies that we do today. And the investment in it drove down those costs. And investment in any one of the climate solutions, whether it's planting mangroves or doing something that puts more carbon in the ocean. As we do that, we're going to learn from it, and we'll be more cost effective and do it better. So only looking at it from a systems perspective and the entire life cycle cost of doing it is only by doing all of that, as well as the research into the technique, will we be able to optimize that. So it's both the technologies, the impacts, but also examining the whole life cycle.
That's excellent, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent way of framing it. And I'm sure that Julie and Rick have more to say about this topic too. But Margaret, what you just said resulted in a number of questions here from the audience. So I do want to honor that. In particular, there's one question that relates to the fact that whenever there's a conversation about climate action, there's also conflict, right? Some of this conflict comes about because of the tension, and it can be real or perceived, between what's profitable today and what will make tomorrow profitable, or I might say what would make tomorrow even possible. And the question from the audience talks a little bit about that. Research is important, but the solution to the potential, say, for ecological collapse will not necessarily come from research. Says our audience member, it will come only with change of economic practice. So what societal changes can you suggest to avert catastrophe? So how are we going to sort of navigate that tension? The economics in the end drives a lot. Where are you all with that?
So we've spoken about already the emissions reduction side of it, and what you see showing up in terms of businesses are the net zero commitments that they then make more granular through programs like the Science Based Targets Initiative. So it's not a matter of waiting to 2050 for net zero, that there's these incremental targets that are achieved that can really create that pathway to turn us away from some of these more dramatic tipping points that we face. So I want to call that out, because I think the attention and focus of large numbers of businesses, be they multinationals or small scale local businesses, is really a lever in all of this. There's no doubt that what we face is a really dramatic and sustained transformation in the underpinnings of how we operate, and how that plays out across different industries is both a challenge and an opportunity. And that's why you see so many actors and entities coming into the mix with solutions. I think one of the things we haven't spoken about is well, to amplify Margaret's comment about the iterative nature of how we approach these solutions, but also the level of coordination that is called for in fielding these solutions, and particularly when we think of them as projects with really quite high levels of capitalization that are required.
And this iterative nature you speak to answers actually some of the questions that I'm seeing from the audience about how you can balance the need for more research with its inherent slowness, with this pressing need to act now. And maybe that iterative approach might be one way in which that can be achieved. But something you said also made me think, going back to the earlier question, whether or not there's a role to play here on the part of the consumers. I was having a conversation with somebody who at one point gave me the example about organic produce, right? We're willing to pay a premium for produce that is produced in organic ways because we believe that that's the way in which we should be growing our food. So is there a way in which the consumers can drive this desire to purchase carbon neutral energy or purchase, any kind of goods that are produced in ways that are that don't add to our problem or maybe take away from our problem. Is that a trend that you all are seeing?
The green premium is real. I mean, we see this show up in the carbon offsets markets. There's increasing signals that the ocean-based ones, like the mangrove restoration projects or seagrass protections, that these are really valued quite highly because of their considered premium type credits. And as we see more of those come to market, right now they're just being snatched up really quickly because they have so many benefits. They benefit the local communities. They're often creating and nurturing biodiversity hotspots in the ocean. I mean, the co-benefits are quite high. And so I think that, that is an example of the premium in action.
Yeah, thank you. Margaret and Rick, do you all have any thoughts about that?
I would add that I think part of the way that we get there, use the organic produce example, the consumer can relate. In that case, it may be to their overall health, their physical fitness, if you will. And heretofore, the climate signal has not been felt by the public as personally or viscerally, except in certain places. So if you go to Alaska, if you go to Hawaii, if you go to the Pacific Islands, they're feeling it. And that signal will be felt more by the public throughout the country, throughout the world, with each passing day. And so I think the price people are willing to pay for a carbon premium, if you will, is going to be something they're much more willing to contribute to. You look at, if you bought a car in Europe 10 years ago, you got a full set of carbon footprint data, emissions data, and it's only recently in the United States you start to see that because people are starting to recognize this actually relates to their lifestyle or their own economic or financial status. So I think that's starting to come home and people will be much more willing to pay the price, as it were.
Yeah, so Rick, the fact that you talked about how does it relate to an individual's life, their livelihood, their health, that relates to a question that I have here from the audience. Someone who's talking about contacting their politicians and how they can excite their politicians to accept the fact that, we need to do things differently. And here I bring a little bit of experience working in the US Gulf Coast where sea level rise is a reality, and communities are certainly not claiming that it's not because it's a lived experience for them. So can we speak a little bit more about that, of how we can connect the work that we're doing to the lives of everyday individuals to help them really understand the importance of this?
Yeah, I think that is really critical, and Rick just spoke about this, and I would use California as an example. Everybody, a lot of people. I've lived in 5 different states, and I think that a lot of people look at California and say, oh, it's the tree huggers. Oh, they're such environmentalists, but it's really the economics of what's happening that is driving the support in California. I know my neighbors, are not just saying that they're going to approve, higher costs for electricity because they want more trees or wildflowers or, all those environmental things. They're looking at it saying, look at the wildfires. Look at the flooding that we're having from atmospheric rivers. Look at the sea level rise. We just had 3 people killed with a coastal bluff collapse here in the San Diego region a couple of years ago. And all of those things people see, and they see the impact for them and the cost to the state of dealing with those emergencies. And so even when we had, a moderately downturned economic environment in California, people were willing to pay for it. And I think that that's really going to be the most powerful piece. And as Rick said, when people start seeing the impact on the cost of food because of agriculture, or the cost of insurance because of sea level rise, it gets their attention more readily.
Yeah, those are really great examples. Thank you, Margaret. This idea around what consumers can do seems to have spurred a few more questions. So here's one. So there's consumers, and so consumers can certainly drive what the market is doing. And then there's government subsidies, right? So can we speak a little bit more about how consumers compete with government subsidies, or when it comes to driving incentives for companies to choose more sustainable or carbon neutral practices? Is that something you all can speak to at all?
I want to just make a comment on the government subsidies part, because we haven't really talked about environmental justice in this conversation thus far. And I'm not suggesting an equation between subsidies and EJ, but I do think part of the answer to that question you're asking too about is that we do need to look carefully at how we have done in the past, and are we attending to the needs of communities that, for whatever reason, it's not just socioeconomic, it could be a number of reasons, have been unserved or underserved. And I would argue some of the communities on the coast of Alaska, for example, have not been the beneficiaries of investments, and now are the ones paying the biggest price in terms of having to retreat from their homes. And consequently, I would not put it into a subsidies category, but I do think it is a responsibility that we have to make sure that all Americans, or the beneficiaries of the taxes that we pay, get the products and services owed them.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I'm on a board for the that's advisory to the Army Corps of Engineers, and we recently had a meeting in Alaska where essentially the conversation was around how we can modify the rubric that the Army Corps uses in order to prioritize projects to take into account that these communities, even though the population density is low, have traditionally been underserved. So how can we elevate the projects that are associated with those regions? So I think these conversations are actively being had across the government sector. So thank you for pointing that out.
One related topic is we're seeing more and more businesses examine and give attention to their scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions that are due to their supply chain. And this also ties to the vulnerability that we're seeing in supply chains in relation to climate impacts. So the more detailed and granular that companies get, we're seeing a lot of multinationals go in this direction of saying, okay, so we're seeing that parts of our supply chain have are causing harm, say in the Amazon by deforestation for palm oil. You can avoid that type of damage, but then you can go a step further and say, going from doing no harm to doing good. So what about going and reforesting parts of the Amazon? And I'm really excited to see when that kind of attention to the supply chain scope 3 emissions will start to impact ocean related activities, because then we have more of an opportunity to improve water quality, coastal health, lots of types of topics that intersect with environmental justice, and just using the lever of the business side of things without even looking at the interaction with the government. I think that will be really quite powerful in combination.
That's clever. That's very clever, Julie. And that also brings gives me the opportunity to bring a question from the audience, since you mentioned multinational efforts. An audience member is interested in knowing if there are any insights from outside of Western European, US, Canada axis of research and action that could be brought to bear, and how we can prioritize investments. Barbados, Philippines, is there something more to be learned from that international perspective?
Just one of the things that struck me is being in the Philippines was just the adaptive capacity of the people. And there's the flip side of that is they're not accustomed to relying on their government for a lot of help through the crises, and their level of community resilience is extremely high. That also means they rely on each other, and I think we see a range of different countries that are looking at how they can insulate populations from climate impacts. And there's a lot of frontline communities that are facing these particular topics right now. There's a lot to learn in those regards.
Yeah. And many solutions are local. You talk about human capacity, adaptive capacity. That does bring me to a question that I've always asked myself. As humans, we have a hard time thinking about 100 years out when we have week-to-week struggles that we're dealing with, right? We have a tendency to think in dichotomies, fight amongst ourselves for resources that are scarce. But yet humans also have a tendency to rise to a challenge, to be inspired, to inspire. Humans have a way of doggedly pursuing a long-term goal. We can accomplish things that seem impossible. And so I want to bring it back to that sort of hopeful thinking, like you all are doing some really difficult work, some very long-term, long horizon work, a marathon. How do you maintain positivity and hope as you're doing this work? Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Well, I spend as much time as I can around youth. And I'm serious. I mean, I have been so impressed. I wish I was that intelligent and organized and passionate when I was in my late teens, early 20s. And there are some really remarkable formal engagements of youth around the world that are starting to have an impact. Earth Echo, Heirs to Our Oceans, variety of groups. And the fact that they are that engaged, that they want to learn about policy as well as science and technology, and they want to find solutions. Most of them are not wringing their hands. They're saying, we can solve this, we've got to solve this. To me, that's very inspiring. And I think as long as we focus on the solutions, and youth are part of the solutions, you can be both realistic and optimistic. So that's how I keep going.
I totally agree. Being at a university and seeing what the students can do is absolutely inspiring. And they also they've spent their whole lives in this very entrepreneurial culture that we're in now, and they're very interested in developing their ideas and in the potential to create a company or a nonprofit or something that will have that impact. So it is, they absolutely are the thing that gives me confidence in the future and that gives me optimism for the future.
Thank you, Margaret. Any closing thoughts from you on that, Julie?
Yeah, I think we're really fortunate to be able to have insight and foreknowledge about what these pathways could look like for society and the choices that are available to us. And, I call out in particular the modeling capabilities and the development of enhanced computational approaches and techniques that you all are working with and incubating at OSU and some of your new initiatives, and really the faculty with the broad interdisciplinary skills that Rick mentioned, and the training of the students that Margaret and Rick mentioned, and really the combined sort of assets and talent and skills that this represents. And that is really a source of hope for me.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. I know we have a lot of students in the audience today, and I know they are inspired by what they heard you all say. And it's so cool that this is a feedback loop, that you all are inspired just as much by them. It's the people and the technologies and the tools that we can bring to bear. And boy, I knew this hour would pass quickly. It's passed even more quickly than I thought it would. I want to thank the three of you again for your time, for your insights, for your passion, for your work, for just inspiring us. And I want to turn it back over to Des to close this out. Thank you very, very much to our audience as well.
Well, thank you, Tuba, for moderating such a powerful and important conversation. And Julie, Margaret, Richard, sorry, Rick.
Rick.
We just thank you for your leadership and for the ways you're working for a better planet for all of us and the example you set for beavers everywhere. And thank you to our audience for bringing so much curiosity and their thoughtful questions. I think we have enough questions for a whole other panel at this point. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming and have a wonderful evening and happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.